This one's wife. Strip them. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. There has been a body of opinion that has advocated for the removal of the titles from this one and this one's wife. This has gone on for a number of years. Essentially, the basis for this is that they are not working members of the royal family, and their behaviour does not merit the retention of those titles, since they have simply been, to put it mildly, unhelpful towards the institution that is the monarchy. The calls for the removal of their titles have taken on an increased resonance as of late, following the stripping of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. And, perhaps sensing blood, and striking while the iron is hot, there are many people that maintain that the king ought to now follow up on that and remove the titles from the Sussexes. An opinion piece that appears in the Spectator provides us with a very interesting set of observations about the case for them being stripped. In case you're not familiar, the Spectator is a weekly British political and cultural news magazine. It was first published back in 1828, making it the oldest surviving magazine in the world. It's politically conservative, and it mainly talks about politics and culture. It actually has seen many of its editors utilise it as a stepping stone to high office within the Conservative Party, as past editors have included Boris Johnson, Ian Gilmore, Ian MacLeod, Nigel Lawson, and Michael Gove, the former Conservative MP, is now its editor. He's gone in the other direction. The opinion piece sets out the case and is written by Lee Cohen. It commences by explaining the king acted with decisive authority to strip his brother Andrew of his royal title and evict him from his Windsor mansion. The former Duke of York is now known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, and he must vacate Royal Lodge for private accommodation at Sandringham. No formal letters patent were issued, nor was parliamentary legislation required. The king's prerogative sufficed. In other words, the king's say-so can achieve it. The action, though severe, reflects a man whose associations, never proven criminal, had become untenable for an institution whose legitimacy rests on public trust. Now, that final sentence is particularly important in the context of the monarchy as a whole and Harry and this one's wife, an institution whose legitimacy rests on public trust. It could be argued that a monarchy has no place in a modern society. The individuals concerned receive titles and privilege simply based upon accident of birth and don't play any meaningful role. Nevertheless, royal families continue to exist around the world, and the British royal family is perhaps the most famous of them all. And it continues because public trust allows it to do so. If it loses that, it not only loses its legitimacy, it could result in its becoming effectively obsolete. This is something that Harry, because he's thick, and this one's wife, because she's a self-absorbed narcissist, don't understand. That they are only tolerated with regard to their titles by virtue of the trust that the people have in the institution to which they are attached. And rather like somebody sitting on a branch and then sawing the very branch that you're sat upon, the Sussex have spent their time throwing pelters at the institution without thinking through, you're actually cutting your own noses off to spite your face, which of course, as I've explained to you previously, is a typical activity of a mid-range narcissist such as this one's wife. Her preoccupation with the pursuit of the prime aims in the moment means she invariably engages in actions which have collateral consequences which come back to bite her on the backside. They have been behaving in a manner which erodes trust, which means that the monarchy is adversely affected, they are still associated with the monarchy, and furthermore, that erosion of trust has resulted in people calling for their titles to be stripped, but they don't get it. Yet another challenge persists. The conduct of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, having stepped back from royal duties in 2020, agreed when they left the family to forego commercial use of the title HRH and the brand Sussex Royal. They retain their ducal titles, but the late Queen's directive was unequivocal. Royal status must not be commodified. Their subsequent ventures, Netflix's Harry and This One's Wife series, Spotify's Archetype podcast, and Harry's memoir Spare, have leaned heavily on their Sussex identities for marketing and profit. While they do not use HRH commercially, the persistent invocation of Duke and Duchess on platforms such as Sussex.com and in media deals skirts the spirit of the agreement. The boundary between public duty and private gain has been eroded. Indeed, we have repeatedly seen where This One's Wife insists on being referred to as Duchess of Sussex when she makes an appearance. The contrast with Andrew is instructive. His scandals were excruciating, but born of poor judgment and settled civilly without admission of liability. The Sussexes' output, by contrast, is active and deliberate. A sustained public narrative of grievance, broadcast globally for substantial financial reward. The Oprah interview, Netflix documentary, and Spare detail family tensions, media pressures, and institutional shortcomings. Whether framed as transparency or self-promotion, the content has undeniably damaged the royal family. Again, this demonstrates an important distinction and, in some respects, increases the case for them to be stripped of their titles. There's no doubt that what Andrew was accused of was particularly unsavoury, and it's not just in relation to him being an ardent sex case, but the financial shenanigans, the involvement with Chinese spies, etc. All of it is rather a mess, and one suspects there's yet more to come out. However, it is fair to say this was a consequence of simple poor judgment. A narcissist himself, Andrew operated in the moment to seek gratification through getting his end away, through gratification of the receipt of monies, his haughtiness and his arrogance resulting in him being particularly belligerent with the people that he dealt with. His activity ultimately has also damaged the monarchy, but it went about it in a different route. Harry and This One's Wife chose a narrative, a public one, of grievance. They chose a public narrative of victimhood, and they very roundly pointed the finger through the Oprah interview, their Netflix documentary, the content of Spare, as saying, this is the institution that is the problem. Naturally, it was driven by This One's Wife's need for the prime aims in the moment, as ever is the case. However, the consequence of that is that it is an active campaign of public grievance against the royal family, and in effect smacks of a greater degree of treachery and traitorous behaviour compared to that of Andrew. And thus, by comparison, one might suggest that whilst Andrew certainly is an arsehole, he just blundered around in his own self-absorption. With regard to This One's Wife and Harry, their self-absorption was such that they positively wanted to maintain a narrative of the royal family being nasty and they being the victims. And thus, it would be seen that their damage that they caused to the royal family was more focused. If you will, Andrew was like a scattered bomb going off, whereas with Harry and This One's Wife, there were targeted missiles. Stripping Andrew of his princely style was within the king's gift. Removing a peerage, such as Duke of Sussex, however, requires an Act of Parliament. I have set out in detail the the steps that would be needed to remove the titles in an earlier video, utilising legal and historical information, which you may find particularly interesting and instructive. Precedent exists in the Titles Deprivation Act of 1917, which stripped enemy peers during the First World War, but no such mechanism has been invoked in modern times for disloyalty alone. The government has signalled no appetite for legislation targeting the Sussexes, and constitutional experts say that their titles, unlike Andrew's HRH, are hereditary and protected by law. Revoking them would demand cross-party consensus and risk politicising the monarchy, a step even Republican-leaning Labour MPs have declined to pursue. Still, the King retains levers short of statute. He could further restrict the Sussexes' access to royal platforms, clarify succession protocols to minimise their Council of State roles, or issue guidance limiting commercial use of titles in official contexts. Andrew's demotion required no public vote. Future clarifications of royal branding could follow the same sovereign path. The monarchy's endurance hinges on reputation, trust and adaptability, not sentiment. The King and the Prince of Wales have rightly prioritised institutional integrity over familial loyalty, as evidenced by Andrew's swift marginalisation. The Sussexes' continued prominence, sustained by titles they no longer serve, tests that resolve. Their defenders argue that free speech and financial independence justify their path. Monarchists counter that duty. Once accepted, carries lifelong restraint. Both positions hold merit, but the Crown cannot indefinitely tolerate the assaults of its honours by those who critique it from afar. Andrew's punishment was just and proportionate. The Sussexes' case is more complex, not criminal, not passive, but a calculated divergence from the late Queen's vision. Equity does not demand identical treatment, but it does require consistency. Why should quitters, who work in the service of nothing and no one but themselves, enjoy these honours that are gifts from the nation they left behind introduced? And to my mind, that is at the heart of the matter. If the King or his heir wish to fortify the monarchy against future division, they must address the Sussex anomaly with the same clarity applied to Andrew. Not through parliamentary theatre, but through quiet sovereign authority, reaffirming that the Crown's prestige is not a private franchise. The line has been drawn. The institution that has united Britain through centuries of trial now demands that all who bear its titles uphold its purpose, or step fully beyond its shadow. Duty must prevail over disloyalty, restraint over self-promotion. In that balance lies the monarchy's future and Britain's quiet strength. A well-articulated argument for action to be taken against the Sussexes, and it is based upon the fact that they are disloyal. As mentioned, Andrew is a narcissistic fool, but he wasn't disloyal. You might argue that his actions were tantamount to disloyalty, but that wasn't the primary mover in relation to them. Whereas, with the Sussexes, they have portrayed themselves, they've cast themselves in the image of victims that have been beat upon by a cruel and racist institution. That has been their shtick. And as such, why should they be allowed to benefit from the very institution that they have repeatedly attacked and, in effect, spat in the eye of the British public? The case is that they ought to be stripped. Now it remains to be seen whether King Charles's resolve, or more likely King William's, will see this through. I'm H.D. Tudor. Thank you for listening.